There's a particular kind of power that wears grease-stained overalls, and the men who fear it most are always the last ones to recognize it for what it is. Della Voss had been fixing engines since she was 9 years old, standing on an overturned milk crate beside her father in a cramped garage on the south side of the city, learning the specific language that machines spoke when something inside them was broken. That language was not taught in schools. It lived in the hands, in the patience, in the ability to stay quiet long enough that the machine told you its own secret. By 16, she could diagnose a failing transmission by the pitch of a single gear shift. By 19, she had rebuilt a V8 from components. 3 other shops had declared unsalvageable. By 26, she owned Voss Automotive outright, a double-bay garage on Crestline Avenue with a hand-painted sign above the rolling steel door and a 6-month waiting list that included 3 city councilmen, 2 surgeons, and a federal judge who drove 4 hours from the Capitol and considered it entirely reasonable to do so. Della Voss did not need anyone to tell her she was good at what she did. What she did not have, because she had never chased it, was the kind of attention the world volunteered freely to women who looked a certain way. She was a big woman, wide-shouldered and soft-bellied, built for endurance rather than elegance, with thick, dark braids she pinned out of her way each morning and hands permanently mapped with the faint ghost of engine oil no matter how carefully she cleaned them. She had a garage, a waiting list, her father's silver ring on her right hand, and the deed to the building in her name. That felt like enough until the Thursday morning in November when a gunmetal gray Aston Martin DB12 rolled through her bay door at 7:43, 11 minutes before she opened, driven by a man she had never met but whose photograph she had seen on the front page of the city paper 4 times in the past 2 years. His name was Calum Rath. In the legitimate world, he was a private equity principal controlling a portfolio of logistics companies, real estate holdings, and manufacturing concerns that employed nearly 800 people. In the world that actually mattered in this city, he was the operating head of the Rath Syndicate, a criminal organization that had run the southern half of the city's shadow economy for 31 years, first under his uncle Petrov, and for the past 7 under Calum himself. Petrov having died 4 years ago after running the organization for 24 years before that, with Calum having taken the helm at 34. He was 41 years old, 6'2", and possessed of the particular stillness belonging exclusively to men who have never once been uncertain whether they would get what they wanted. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw carved by someone with strong opinions, and eyes the color of deep water, gray-green and thoroughly unreadable. He stepped out of the Aston Martin in a charcoal suit that had not been purchased in this country, looked around her garage with the faintly assessing expression of a man cataloging the worth of everything he surveyed, and said, without preamble, that he had been told she was the best. Della was under the lift on a Range Rover at the time. She did not come out. She said from beneath the vehicle that she was not open yet. He said the car was making a sound. She said most cars did. A pause. Then the sound of expensive leather shoes on concrete, unhurried, as he crouched down so she could see him from her position on the rolling creeper, forearms on his knees, regarding her with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite irritation, but occupied the precise and unnerving territory between them. He said he had been told she did not take walk-ins. She said he had been told correctly. He said he was not accustomed to being told no. She slid out from beneath the Range Rover, stood, wiped her hands on the rag at her belt, and looked at him with the same level, unhurried attention she gave to engines that were pretending to be fine. She told him she found that very easy to believe, and that he should come back in 6 months with an appointment. Then she went back under the Range Rover. Calum Rath stood in her garage for 12 more seconds. She counted them. She heard the precise click of his footsteps retreating, the Aston Martin turning over with its distinctive low snarl, and then the sound of it pulling into the November morning. She waited until the sound had fully disappeared, then she allowed herself a single, slow exhale. He came back the next morning, 7:41, 2 minutes earlier than the day before, which she noted with the part of her brain that noticed patterns compulsively. Same car, same suit, or an identical one. He walked through the open bay door, set his keys on her workbench with the decisive placement of a man setting down something he fully intended to reclaim, and said the car had developed a hesitation in the throttle response between 2,000 and 3,000 revolutions per minute that had not been there yesterday. She looked at him over the engine bay she was working on and said it was possible, given that she had not worked on the car, that the hesitation had also not been there yesterday. He said he was quite certain it was there now. She said she was fully booked. He said he would wait. She said the wait was 6 months. He said he had nowhere pressing to be until 9. The absolute audacity of it was so breathtaking that for a moment she simply looked at him. He looked back, perfectly composed, one hand in the pocket of the charcoal suit, and if the situation struck him as in any way unreasonable, he gave no indication of it whatsoever. Della pulled her appointment book from beneath the counter, ran her finger down the page with deliberate theatricality, and told him she had a slot available on the 14th of May of the following year. He took out his phone, opened his calendar, and asked what time. She told him she was absolutely not being serious. He said he was. She picked up his keys from the workbench and held them across the space between them. He looked at the keys. He looked at her. He did not move for the keys. He asked what it would take to move to the front of the list. She said no amount of money. He said that was an interesting position for a small business to take. She said her business was not small. It was exclusive, and she would appreciate it if he took his car and his throttle hesitation to one of the 17 other mechanics in the city and allowed her to get back to work. He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed through that gray-green gaze that was not quite surprise, because she did not think Calum Rath could be surprised by conventional means, but something adjacent to it. Then he took the keys from her hand, and his fingers closed around them and around her fingers, both for just a fraction of a second, warm and entirely deliberate, before he released her and walked back to the car. He came back the following morning. This time the engine was making a noise she could hear from across the bay, a rhythmic, metallic ticking emphatic enough that even the most mechanically indifferent person would have had to acknowledge it. She stood with her arms folded and listened to it, idle. He stood beside the open driver's door watching her listen, and neither of them said anything. When she was ready, she asked him what he had done to it. He said he had simply driven it. She said the number 3 cylinder was misfiring in a manner consistent with a fouled spark plug, and that a fouled plug in an 11-month-old car presumably serviced on schedule was the mechanical equivalent of a healthy person suddenly developing scurvy. It did not happen by accident. He said she clearly knew her engines. She said she clearly did, which was why she knew that whatever was wrong with his car this morning had not been wrong with it 2 days ago, and she would very much like to know what he had done in the interval. He did not answer. He smiled instead, just slightly, one corner of his mouth, and it was an extraordinarily effective smile in a way that Della found professionally irritating. She stood in the November morning light with her arms still folded and her braids pinned back and oil already on her left wrist, and she understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the car had been deliberately damaged, probably by disconnecting a plug wire and reconnecting it imperfectly, which was the action of someone who wanted an excuse to be here without admitting he wanted an excuse to be here. The second was that this understanding gave her leverage she had not possessed 2 days ago. She said she could fix it in 40 minutes. The rate was $280 up front, and he would wait outside. He produced a card. She ran it. She fixed the plug wire in 22 minutes. She made him wait the full 40 before rolling the car out and handing him the receipt with a professional nod that dismissed him as thoroughly as any words she might have chosen. He took the receipt, folded it precisely in half, and put it in his interior breast pocket as though it were a document of significance. He came back the next morning. This became the rhythm of November. He arrived always before she officially opened, always with some new and inventive ailment befalling the Aston Martin. A slow, coolant weep from a loosened hose clamp, a sticking brake caliper on the rear passenger side, a rattle from the dashboard that turned out to be a single bolt wedged deliberately between the console and center stack. She fixed each one without comment, charged the full rate, and made him wait outside. He paid without complaint every time, which told her that money was entirely beside the point of this enterprise. She did not ask him why. She was 41 years old herself, in the same year as this man she had not known 3 weeks ago, and she had not arrived at the ownership of a business she was proud of by pretending not to know answers she already had. He was coming back because she had told him no. The complication, and she acknowledged it only to herself at the end of each day when the shop was locked and she sat in the small office with a cup of coffee going cold on her father's desk, was that she looked forward to it, not to him specifically. Or so she told herself, to the diagnostic puzzle of it, to the precise and specific silence of a man not accustomed to waiting. She had spent a great deal of her professional life being spoken over, dismissed, and condescended to by men who had not built half of what she had built. Caleb Rath was something different. He owned every room he entered, and yet he stood in the cold outside her garage because she told him to, and something about that particular geometry felt, privately, remarkable. She did not permit herself to examine this feeling too closely. The situation changed on a Tuesday in the third week of November at 11:47 in the morning when a man she had never seen before walked through her bay door while she was alone. Both assistants were out. The man was large, with the specific physical architecture of someone employed for the purpose of being large, and he carried the quiet, professional menace she recognized as belonging to the shadow economy rather than the legitimate one. He told her that her landlord had decided not to renew her lease at the end of December, that this was not negotiable, and that she would be wise to begin making other arrangements. She said that she owned the building. He paused. She said it again, slowly. She owned the building. She had owned it for 4 years, bought it outright with 11 years of double shifts and every dollar she did not require for the minimum cost of survival. Her name was on the deed at the county recorder's office since the spring 4 years prior. There was no landlord. There was no lease. And whatever parties were interested in the property would need a very large sum of money and a compelling reason. And even then the answer was likely no. The man's menace recalibrated itself. He took out a phone, turned away, spoke quietly for approximately 30 seconds, then left without another word. She knew with complete certainty whose name was at the far end of that call, and it was not any landlord's. Someone had told Caleb Rath that her building could be pried out from under her, and either he had believed it without checking, or he had sent this man without caring. Neither interpretation was particularly flattering. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in a cold, clarifying fury that had nothing theatrical about it. When Caleb Rath arrived the next morning at 7:39, 4 minutes earlier than his previous record, she was standing outside the bay door with the printed deed in her hand. She did not let him speak first. She gave him the address, the parcel number, the date of acquisition, and the purchase price, in that order. She told him she was not a tenant who could be displaced. She told him that if anyone connected to him entered her property again under any pretext that was not the legitimate repair of a vehicle, she would be filing a complaint with the district attorney's office. And she had the private cell number of someone in that office who took her calls because she had rebuilt that person's car twice and done it well. She told him to take his car and not come back. She went inside and closed the rolling bay door. She stood in the sudden interior dark and allowed herself 1 minute of being afraid before she converted the fear entirely into focus and went back to work. He did not come the next morning or the morning after. The silence was more noticeable than she had any right to let it be. She had become accustomed to the disruption. Now its absence was itself a disruption. This was inconvenient information about herself that she filed away without acting on it. On the third morning of his absence, her phone rang from a number she did not recognize. She answered because she always answered her business line. The voice was a woman's, low and controlled, identifying herself as his executive assistant, who said that Mr. Rath wished to convey his apologies for the property inquiry and that it had been pursued on incomplete information and without his direct authorization. Della said she was glad to hear it. The assistant said that Mr. Rath also wished to make a personal apology, but understood if she was not interested in receiving one. Della said she was not sure she was. The assistant thanked her and ended the call. By 4 o'clock, Della had revised her position to she was willing to hear it and was not obligated to accept it. By 6, when she locked up, she had not heard from him, and her position had returned to not caring. He came the next morning at 7:41. No car. He walked from wherever he had parked, carrying 2 coffees in a carrier from the place 3 blocks west. And he looked, for the first time in all the mornings she had known him, like a man not entirely certain of his reception. She looked at the coffees, then at him. He said they were both black because he did not know how she took it and had not wanted to assume. She said she took hers black. He said that was fortunate. She took one of the coffees. She did not invite him in, but she did not send him away. They stood in the bay door with the November morning pressing in around them, and he told her that the inquiry into her property had been made by a member of his organization acting on incomplete information who had not known the property was owned rather than leased, and that he would not have authorized the approach regardless, because that was not how he preferred to conduct himself. She asked what the property had been wanted for. He told her in careful terms whose shape was clear enough to anyone who did not need things fully spelled out. There was a logistics arrangement requiring a point of operations in this part of the city, vehicles that needed a legitimate-appearing workshop to pass through at intervals. Mechanical needs his current arrangements had not been satisfactorily meeting. She looked at him for a long time. She said that she was hearing that he had been trying, in a roundabout and entirely disastrous way, to acquire not just a building, but also a mechanic. He said that was an accurate summary, yes. She said he could have simply asked. He said he had been told she would not be interested. She asked who had told him that, and he said the name. It was the name of a man she knew slightly, a competitor from across town who had bid on the same property 4 years ago and lost, who had been telling people ever since that she had obtained the building through irregular means. Slanderous and ironic, given that this same man had apparently brought Calum Rath incomplete information for his own purposes. She set down her empty cup. She said she ran a legitimate business and intended to continue doing so. She was not interested in being a front or a pass-through or anything that would put her license or her deed or her father's ring at risk. He said he knew that. She said, then what exactly was he asking her? He said that he had vehicles requiring work by someone genuinely excellent rather than merely willing, that he was prepared to pay at rates that would make her waiting list irrelevant because she could hire additional staff, that everything on paper would be entirely clean because the vehicles themselves were not the problem and the work would be fully legitimate, and that he would also like, if she was willing, to personally apologize for November. She looked at him for so long that lesser men would have found something else to look at. He did not. She said she would think about the business arrangement, She said she accepted the apology. He nodded once, the way people nod when they are relieved, but too controlled to show it fully. He picked up both empty cups and walked away down Crest Lane, and she watched him go with the specific attention she gave to engines she had not yet fully understood, but was beginning to believe she could fix. She said yes to the business arrangement 10 days later in writing through her attorney, with terms she had drafted herself and that were clear enough that any ambiguity in them was intentional and entirely hers. What passed between Della Voss and Calum Rath over the months that followed was not easily named. Not courtship exactly, though it had elements of courtship in it. Not purely professional, though grounded in the professional in ways she never let drift far. What it was, she decided, was an education running in both directions. He learned that she was not only as good as described, but better, that her work reduced his vehicle's maintenance incidents by 37% in the first quarter, which his logistics director reported with genuine bewilderment. He learned that she ran her business with financial precision that would have impressed in a much larger operation, and that she had structured her affairs to insulate herself completely from the kind of vulnerability his associate had mistakenly assumed she possessed. She learned that he read 3 newspapers before 6 in the morning, that he had opinions about brake compound metallurgy that were rudimentary but not entirely uninformed, that he had learned to drive from his uncle Petrov at age 12 in an empty industrial lot in a car with no working radio, and that the stillness she had initially read as pure control was in fact the discipline of a man who felt things quite strongly and had simply never been offered a context in which feeling them was safe. She did not offer him that context. He found his way to it himself, incrementally across winter mornings that became spring mornings, that became the long, light evenings of early summer. The problem arrived in the form of a woman named Vivienne Carré. Vivienne was 34, extraordinarily beautiful in the specific sculpted manner of someone whose beauty was also a professional instrument, and she had been Calum Rath's companion for 2 years in the category of relationship that was visible at events and photographed occasionally and never clearly defined. Della had known about her in the abstract way she knew many things adjacent to Calum Rath, which was to say, she knew what she observed and did not speculate beyond what was in front of her. What was in front of her on a Friday evening in June was Vivienne's car, a white Porsche Taycan, booked for a routine service under Vivienne's own name 3 weeks prior, because Della took all bookings the same way regardless of whose name was attached to them. Vivienne herself did not come with the car. She sent a driver to drop it and said she would collect it the following morning. Della serviced the car. She was thorough, as she always was, constitutionally incapable of doing work halfway. And in the course of being thorough, she found something that was not the result of normal wear, was not the result of any mechanical failure, and was not something Vivienne Carré knew was there. It was a tracking device. Not a commercial consumer product, but a professional-grade unit requiring specific contacts to obtain. Mounted in the rear wheel, well in a position and visible without the wheel removed, which Della had removed for brake inspection. She stood with it in her hand for a long moment. Then she put it in the steel tray on her bench and sat on her rolling stool and thought carefully. She thought about whose organization had the capability to obtain that device. She thought about who would have had access to the car. She thought about whether Calum Rath knew his companion's car was carrying a professional tracker, and whether if he knew it, he would have told her. And the answer to the second part was no, certainly not. And the answer to the first part was something she could not know without asking. She called him. He arrived in 11 minutes, which told her things about where he had been and how seriously he received her call. She showed him the device without preamble. She watched his face change. It was subtle, a compression around the eyes and a stillness that deepened beyond even his usual stillness, and she understood she was watching a man update a calculation with very significant consequences, doing so with the complete external composure of someone who had been managing lethal information his entire adult life. He asked where she found it. She told him the exact location and the direction it was oriented, which mattered for understanding the range and network it communicated with. He asked if she had removed it. She said she had, that it was in the tray and that she had not interfered with it further because she did not know what interference would mean for whatever was being monitored at the other end. He said she had done exactly the right thing. She said she needed to know if he put it there. He looked at her and said he had not. She said she believed him, and she needed him to tell her what to do with it because it was in her shop, and she was not in the habit of having professional surveillance equipment on her premises. He made 2 short phone calls, and within 20 minutes, 2 men she had never seen before had come and gone with the device in a sealed evidence bag, which told her that at least one of those calls had reached someone who understood chain of custody. Vivian Carre arrived the next morning with a brightness that read, to Della's precise attention, as performance. She was dressed exquisitely, heels on, a Saturday morning, perfume that had its own microclimate, and she looked around Della's garage with the practiced social gaze of someone assessing what merited her notice. That gaze passed over Della in the particular way Della had spent 41 years watching gazes pass over her, landing briefly and then moving on without finding anything requiring further attention. Della gave her the paperwork, processed her card, and sent her on her way with perfect professional courtesy. She heard from Calum at noon. What had been on Vivian's car was the instrument of a surveillance operation being run not from within his organization but against it, by a man named Harlow Steen, who held a position within the syndicate's outer tier and had been feeding location and logistics information to a competing party. For a period of months, his people were now working to determine precisely. Vivian had not known the device was there, a conclusion supported by the access patterns and by Vivian's own interview, conducted in terms Della chose not to ask about. The device had been placed during a window in which Steen had had access to the car at an event 6 weeks prior. Della asked what would happen now. He said the matter was being handled. She said she understood what that meant. He said she probably did, and that he was sorry she was adjacent to it. She said she was not sorry, because if she had not been adjacent to it, the device might have remained long enough to cause damage she did not want to think about, and she would rather know the thing than not know it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said her name, which he rarely used, preferring to speak to her without it in a manner that should have felt impersonal, but had always felt oddly the opposite. He said her name the way a person says something they have been holding carefully and are finally setting down. He said that he had spent a considerable part of the last several months in the company of a woman who was brilliant and capable and had built something extraordinary and who had never once tried to position herself as anything other than exactly what she was, and that he had found this, unexpectedly and somewhat inconveniently, to be the thing he valued most in the world. She was in the small office at her father's desk. Her coffee was hot for once. The evening light came through the window above the filing cabinet at the angle it only reached in summer. She said that inconvenient was an interesting word for it. He said he was a man who had spent 20 years optimizing everything, and this particular feeling had declined to be optimized, which he found both frustrating and remarkable. She asked what feeling specifically. He said the feeling of wanting to deserve being looked at by her the way she looked at things she considered worth understanding. She was quiet for long enough that he said her name again, questioning. She said she was still there, she was thinking. He waited. She had learned, good at waiting when what he waited for was something he actually wanted. She said she would like to have dinner with him, somewhere that was not a garage, and that she would like for this to be a clear and uncomplicated thing rather than something that had to be decoded. She had no interest in being anyone's inconvenient feeling. She was too old and too practical for that, and he would need to decide before they went to dinner what category he was placing her in. He said there was only one category. He said he had only ever wanted one thing to be different about the last several months, and it was that. He had not understood soon enough what was directly in front of him. She said that was a remarkably accurate description of a blind spot. He said he was aware of the irony. She said she would see him Thursday. Thursday arrived clear and warm, and she did not change anything about herself in preparation for it except that she wore her second-best boots and left her hair down for the first time in recent memory, the braids loose across her shoulders, because she liked them that way and had been pinning them back for work so long she sometimes forgot she liked them that way. He arrived at her door rather than a restaurant, which she had not expected, and he looked at her for a moment with the full force of that gray-green gaze with nothing professional mediating it. And whatever he saw, he regarded as though it were important information he intended to keep. He said she looked exactly like herself. She said that was the idea. He said it was perfect. They walked to the restaurant he had chosen, 3 blocks away, not the kind of place requiring reservations, but serving the best fish in the city and entirely unpretentious about it, which told her he had asked someone who knew her what she would like, rather than defaulting to the most expensive option, and she filed that detail beside all the others she had been collecting. Over dinner, in the easy back and forth of 2 people who had already conducted a months-long education in each other's minds, she told him something she had not told anyone in the professional sphere. She told him about the offer she had received in April from a regional automotive group wanting to buy the Voss name, the client list, and the building and scale it to 6 locations, and about how she had declined it, and about the 2 days before she declined it, during which she had genuinely considered whether saying yes would mean she had succeeded, or whether it would mean she had disappeared. He listened without interrupting. He asked what she had concluded. She said she had concluded that she was not interested in scaling herself away from the things she actually did, which was fix engines other people had given up on. 6 locations meant 6 managers meant she was no longer a mechanic, but a franchisor, and she did not want to be a franchisor. He said he thought she had chosen correctly. She said she had not asked for his verdict. He said he knew that, and was offering it anyway, and she could discard it if it was unwelcome. She said it was not unwelcome. She said a lot of people had told her to take the offer, and that it was very odd to hear someone agree with the decision she had actually made. He said the people who had told her to take it understood scale, but not what she was, and those were different things. She set down her fork and looked at him across the table. She said that was a more precise thing than she had expected him to say. He said he had had several months to think about what she was and had reached some conclusions. She said she was listening. He said that she was the most competent person he had encountered in a professional context in his adult life, that this included people in rooms she would find both alarming and impressive, and that what distinguished her from all of them was not only her skill, but the fact that she did not require anyone to acknowledge it in order to exercise it. He said that he had spent his entire career constructing arrangements to make people dependent on his acknowledgement, and that encountering someone who simply did not need it had been the most disorienting experience of his professional life. She said she noticed he had said professional life twice. He said that was because the personal was separate, and he was not sure she was ready for it. She said she had kicked him out of her shop on the first day and threatened a district attorney complaint and asked how ready he needed her to be. He smiled then, fully, which was not something she had seen at full deployment before, and it rearranged his face into something that was both more human and somehow more dangerous, and she decided, sitting across from him in an unpretentious fish restaurant on a Thursday in June, that she was not afraid of either quality. The personal developed the way things develop between 2 people who are both accustomed to being right and not accustomed to being known, which is slowly, carefully and then with a sudden acceleration that surprises them both. She met the people he trusted, which were not many, and they assessed her with various versions of the appraisal she had spent her life receiving from the world, and she allowed them their assessment and let her own conduct revise it, which it did, for every person in that small circle within a matter of weeks. She led him into her father's house behind the shop, the small worn rooms where she had grown up and now lived alone since her father's decline, which was happening slowly and which she was managing with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, researching his condition, organizing his care, setting aside funds for what was coming. She showed him the milk crate she had stood on at 9 years old. He picked it up and turned it in his hands and did not say anything for a moment, and when he set it down, he had the look of a man who had been handed something that revised his understanding of a blueprint he thought he already knew. He told her that his uncle Petrov had died 4 years ago, after more than 2 decades at the organization's head, and that it had been the event that clarified for him irreversibly that the organization he ran was one he had inherited and not entirely one he would have built, and that there were parts of it he had been quietly dismantling for 3 years in ways not visible from the outside, and that he had never told this to anyone before. She said she had suspected something like it. He asked what had given her that impression. She said that a man who was purely what the newspapers said he was would not have walked to her garage without his car and stood in a cold November morning with 2 black coffees and no certainty of his welcome. He looked at her for a long time. He said that he needed her to know that whatever came next, whatever the shape of what they were building, she was not invisible to him. He said he understood this was something the world had inflicted on her in ways both petty and significant, and that he had been guilty of the assumption of it himself in the early days, and that the guilt of that was something he intended to carry rather than ask her to resolve for him. He could only tell her what was true now, which was that she was the most visible person in any room she entered, and he did not know how the room had been failing to notice this before he arrived, and he didn't intend to stop noticing it. She said that was a very long thing to say. He said he had been working up to it since November. She said she knew. He said of course she did. She said she would like him to know in return something that was also true. She had spent a great deal of her life building things that endured. The building, the reputation, her father's care, the waiting list of people who trusted her with what they depended on. She said she did not build for speed, and she did not build without certainty, and she did not build things she intended to discard, and she was telling him this so he understood what it meant when she said that she had been building something in the direction of him for a while now, and she did not say that to anyone, and she needed him to understand the weight of it before she said it again. He said he understood the weight of it. She said then they were clear. He said they were. There's a particular kind of power that wears grease-stained overalls, and the men who come to understand it are altered by it in ways they do not fully anticipate. They find that the world resorts itself. What they thought was noise becomes signal. What they thought was furniture becomes architecture. What they thought was background resolves with startling clarity into foreground, and they cannot subsequently explain why they ever saw it any other way. Calum Rath had broken his own car 11 times in November to get a woman to look at him. She had been looking at him clearly from the first morning. She was simply waiting for him to be worth seeing. He had spent the months since then working on that problem with more genuine effort than he had applied to anything in recent memory, and while she would not have told him he had solved it, she would have told him he was asking the right questions, and that from where she stood in her garage with her deed and her ring and her waiting list and her father's milk crate, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, where everything worth building always started.